July 1st, 1940, the Union Jack fluttered in the wind, flying proudly from the flagpole of a British government building. They'd done that for decades, centuries even. This was on the Isle of Jersey, one of the British Channel Islands, close to France. But then, the Union Jack began to be pulled down, and in its place rose the flag of the Third Reich. Jersey was no longer under British control. It had been occupied by the Germans. Unlike most of Europe, the British mainland during the Second World War remained free of German occupation. The British endured bombing, blockades, and isolation for years without falling. But early in the conflict, the government realised that they could not defend the far-off Channel Isles from a German invasion. They were cut off and left behind. And in mid-1940, German boots marched down the small cobblestone streets and began to round up whatever British civilians and servicemen had been left behind. Now, what would life be like under the Nazis? How were the occupiers eventually forced from the islands? Well, hello time travelers. It's your friend Mike Brady. And today, I'm going to tell you the true story of what life was like for the British under the Nazis. The months of 1940 were a dark time for Europe as German tanks and troops stormed across the continent, taking France and forcing the British army to retreat, tail between their legs. Now, just off the French coast by about 35 kilometres or 19 miles lie the British Channel Islands. The islands had long been a source of contention through history, with a complex background constantly switching from British to French control until finally in 1801 they were formally placed under the sovereignty of the British Crown directly. The islands are actually a medieval holdover from the old English-ruled Duchy of Normandy that dates back to William the Conqueror. Due to their origins in the Byzantine legality of feudalism, the islands are not technically part of the United Kingdom, but are instead crown dependencies, which makes them sort of independent, but with a foreign policy and some laws decided by the British government. Now, for the sake of simplicity, it's best just to think of them as being part of the UK, a few miles from France, and we'll just leave it at that. Now, this obscure corner of the British Empire laboured under German occupation from the fall of France to the end of the war in Europe, but many people outside Britain wouldn't even be able to find them on a map. Now, for reference, the Channel Islands are a small archipelago off the northern coast of France, made up of the inhabited islands of Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, Sark, Herm, as well as some smaller islands that don't really have a large population. From 1939 to 1940, the war seemed far away for the Channel Islands. Life continued as it had done before for centuries, and there were few restrictions, and the fighting was largely being done in the east and around Poland. Conscription was never implemented due to the unique legal situation of the islands, and routes to mainland Britain remained open. And even the tourist trade continued as it had done before, as the British government felt it was an important part of maintaining a sense of normalcy. But in early 1940, however, things began to change in Europe in a big way. Germany broke through French lines by invading through Belgium, and the Netherlands, and the military situation completely collapsed. On the 3rd of June, the British forces in Europe evacuated from Dunkirk. It became clear that the Germans would occupy France in a spectacular victory that would have been unthinkable only a few years before. Paris was occupied on the 14th of June, and this caused a panic among the British command. Once France had fallen, the plan to beat Germany through attrition in the west was ruined. And the next day, on the 15th of June, after the fall of France and the British defeat in Dunkirk, the British government concluded the islands were both physically indefensible and not worth defending in the first place. The citizens of the island were given instruction to evacuate if they wished, and the soldiers stationed in the region were quietly evacuated back to Britain. Now, if the Germans had wished to waste men and materiel on occupying some British islands for the sake of their own pride, they were welcome to do it. Around 25,000 people from across the islands chose to leave their homes behind and flee to Britain, while around 66,000 people remained on the islands and would come under German occupation shortly afterwards. Now, after the fall of France, the occupation of the islands was seen as a natural step for the German military. They were close to the French territory, and that was occupied, and would be difficult for the British to defend. Now, not only would they provide a valuable propaganda victory in occupying British territory, but it would also allow the Germans to test their amphibious invasion capacity in preparation for the occupation of Great Britain proper, something we've talked about in a previous video. Spoiler alert, it wasn't very good. This planned naval invasion would never occur because the islands did not require a large force to be taken in the first place. Now, the occupation of the islands began with a level of extreme caution from the Germans. The British government had chosen not to announce that the islands were undefended, leaving the Germans to assume that they still were. On the 28th of June, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, bombed the harbours of Guernsey and Jersey, as well as a group of trucks that were carrying produce from farms. 44 people were killed in these raids before the announcement was made over the radio that the islands were actually undefended. The Luftwaffe made a test landing on Guernsey's airfield after determining that there truly was no resistance on the island because, surprise, surprise, they weren't actually being shot at. They began to transport troops there to occupy the island. Now, from Guernsey, the troops travelled to Jersey and then the rest of the islands, and by the 4th of July 1940, all of the Channel Islands had a German garrison enforcing their rule. Now, in Britain, the occupation of the Channel Islands was announced via the Times on the 2nd of July to considerable concern amongst both the public and politicians. Now, it wasn't that the islands were important necessarily, but having surrendered them without a fight seemed to be a concession to the Nazis. On the 9th of July, in the House of Lords, Lord Portsea, a man from Jersey, derided the lack of defence as a, quote, breaking of ties with the Crown of over 1,000 years. And the Lord Chancellor responded by calling the Channel Islands an isolated case, and that His Majesty's government have not the least intention of abandoning any possessions in any part of His Majesty's dominions. Now, a successful defence of the islands would have simply been unfeasible in the situation. Now, on that same day, only a few days after the occupation began, the first of the German edicts went out to the civilian population. Residents were restricted from leaving their homes between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. All weapons had to be surrendered, and no ships or boats were permitted to leave the island without express permission from the German garrison. Now, no radio broadcasts could be listened to except for those from German sources, and the use of cars was restricted purely to the military. Shops were forbidden from raising prices, and clocks had to be moved forward an hour to meet German standard time, which is really just petty in my opinion. Now, this was just the beginning of the rules that would be enforced, but over the next 5 years or so, the list would expand and evolve. Now, the newspapers on the island were immediately subject to German oversight and were forced to publish German propaganda. Now, the newspapers produced during the occupation provided the only popular source of information for the British citizens on the island, and what they reported wasn't exactly objective. The papers kept up information on local news and matters in much the same way as they always had. However, when it came to the progress of the war, the presentation was very different. From the early days of the occupation, Allied progress was ignored, while German victories were heavily emphasised. As the war progressed and Germany became increasingly hard-pressed, the issues being faced by the German army were ignored in much the same way that they were in Germany itself. On the island of Sark, the local seigneur, meaning a Channel Islands lord that ruled the island, was a woman named Sybil Hathaway. Now, she encouraged her citizens to remain on the island rather than evacuate. When the German garrison arrived, she had her maid escort them to her manor, where they were treated as guests. She insisted that the German officers bow, kiss her hand, and bow again whenever they visited, and before they were permitted to sit down and negotiate. Through this sort of polite procedure, she was able to convince the German army physician to operate as an island doctor and prevented any more mistreatment of the citizens of the island than would otherwise be necessary. She remained on friendly terms with the garrison for the duration of the occupation. It was a roundabout way of avoiding any unnecessary violence, but has since been criticised as being rather polite to an invading force that wanted to ultimately exterminate huge portions of the human race. A black market also immediately sprang up across the islands, selling to both Germans and the islanders themselves. Now, some people reportedly made quite a fortune from this trade, but after the war, the government preferred to simply let the matter rest and allowed the black market profits to remain with the people who'd made their money. All's fair in love and war, I guess. Now, all in all, the British were fairly well treated when compared to the citizens of Poland or the Soviet Union, mainly for racial reasons. The German High Command saw the British, at least initially, as being Germany's brethren, which is why fighting between British and German troops was often dotted with examples of gentlemanly conduct and good manners. But By contrast, the war on the Eastern Front was a war fired by racial hatred and resulted in countless atrocities inflicted on the local population and surrendered troops. The German Channel Islands garrison soldiers were generally rather well behaved and followed their orders, refraining from looting or overt abuse of power. Now, the civilian governments were even allowed to keep operating under German supervision, and the court system remained intact for prosecuting crimes that didn't involve the Germans. Now, that's not to say that all things were happy on the islands. Soldiers were billeted in the homes of the people once the hotels ran out of beds, and the islands were expected to, in essence, pay for their own occupation. Now, this was difficult because the economy of the islands had collapsed almost immediately once the occupying force arrived, and the Germans wished to make use of the idle labour force. All young men were required to register with the German authorities to be used for labour when necessary, though unlike in other occupied countries, these people were never deported for work on the continent and were actually paid for their efforts, which is a remarkable contrast given that the Reich had a real soft spot for slave labour. Now, thousands of people would work for the Germans as support staff during the occupation, be it as secretaries or in clothing factories. Now, they built one in the area. There was little work available on the islands that wasn't directly involved with the Germans. In 1941, Hitler made the decision to fortify the islands against a possible British counterattack, even though the British had no immediate plan to do anything. Now, this changed the Channel Islands from a backwater to one of the most heavily fortified regions on Earth, and resulted in the construction of prison camps for slave labourers brought there from mainland Europe. At first, the garrison intended to use local labour, but there was a massive pushback from the Channel Islanders who claimed that assisting the enemy in building defences would be in violation of their rights under the laws of war. Now, the Germans, remarkably, agreed, and so over 16,000 people were imported to the islands from mainland Europe. And these were labourers that had been captured by the Germans and ranged from enslaved Jews and Eastern Europeans to French prisoners of war that had been in captivity since the fall of France. The prisoners were treated poorly, and many died in the camps, with forced marches and beatings occurring in daylight in full view of the islanders. The bunkers they built can still be seen today in many places. In fact, the islands were so heavily fortified that a full tenth of the steel and concrete used to build defences along the Atlantic was put into the Channel Islands and not the French coast. Railways were constructed and tunnels were dug that would have allowed the Germans to hold out for far longer than would have been reasonable given the essentially worthless strategic position of the islands. The islands also became home to over 100,000 landmines that were laid by the garrison to prevent a liberation force from landing. It's just a shocking amount of effort, but trust the Germans to over-engineer a solution. As the years went on, tensions between the local people and the garrison flared occasionally. After German citizens were arrested in Iran, originally neutral, but then occupied by the British and Soviets in 1941, the Germans retaliated by arresting and deporting over 2,000 islanders to prison camps in Europe. Now, the people who were arrested were chosen by a range of factors. If they had served as an officer in the First World War, for example, or if they had actually been born in Great Britain, they were considered eligible for imprisonment. Now, simply insulting a German could also potentially lead to someone being deported. And many of these people would die before the war was over, though they would never be subjected to the same conditions faced by prisoners over in the East. Now, food would become a serious issue in the later years of the war too, as the islands had once imported the majority of their food from Great Britain. And once the Allies had taken back control of the surrounding lands, it became nearly impossible to resupply the islands. The citizens were encouraged to grow their own food on whatever land was available, but given the ban on fishing vessels and the lack of space available, conditions quickly deteriorated. The army was allowed to requisition whatever food it needed, but the fact of the matter is that there wasn't enough on the islands to adequately feed everybody. Now, for months, both the garrison and the people suffered on the verge of starvation as the war in Europe raged on. It was only in December 1944 that the Red Cross was allowed to organise a resupply vessel to visit the islands and provide enough food to keep the people fed. As for resistance, there was very little in the way of violence. The resistance on the island was almost always passive and focused more on inconveniencing the garrison and fighting for the rule of law, rather than militant attempts to dislodge the invaders. Now, this has more to do with the physical size of the Channel Islands, where it would be much, much harder to hide a hostile force of guerrilla fighters than in a major city or country. Now, attacks on the garrison never amounted to anything more than individuals letting off steam. One brave woman slapped a German soldier that had made advances on her. After being cut off from the British military and not having any way of coordinating an effective resistance, there was seemingly no point in trying, though islanders did distribute underground newspapers spreading actual news from the Allies. Now, the government of the islands went so far as to actually discourage resistance beyond the official statements. Many members of the civil authorities were angered when people tried to resist when British commandos attempted raids on the islands. Given the small size of the population and the insignificance of the islands, testing the patience of the Germans through futile acts of insubordination would do nothing but make life worse for the sake of pride. All of this led to some German soldiers describing being posted on the Channel Islands as a wartime holiday camp. It was good for them, I guess. There was good weather, nice scenery, an easy job, and locals that were mostly compliant. In a way, this worked out best for most people. The Germans themselves were usually pleased to have been given such a pleasant posting, and they knew that a slip-up could lead to them being sent to the horror of the Eastern Front. So they behaved themselves mostly. In other words, nobody on the islands wanted to rock the boat through unnecessary violence. The people would suffer needlessly, and the Germans could risk losing a cushy job. That's not to say that there weren't some attempts to undermine the Germans. Many of the people assisted in helping the slave labourers escape from their prison camps, while a resistance group, the Jersey Communist Party, was founded during the occupation. Now, this group mainly distributed communist propaganda and tried to help Soviet prisoners escape from their camps. Their most notable act was setting fire to a hotel that German troops were staying in, although nobody actually died. Now, interestingly, the islands were not liberated on D-Day, as you might expect. The Germans had spent many years fortifying the islands and planned to use them to help repel any attempt at liberating mainland Europe. However, given the immense superiority of the Allies at sea and in the air, there was no possibility of the islands being used by the Germans in any meaningful way. It was decided that it would be better to simply blockade the islands and force the Germans to either starve or surrender, with Churchill famously declaring that the British would, quote, "let them starve, no fighting, they can rot at their leisure." The Germans remained in control until the 9th of May 1945, when they finally surrendered and allowed the Allies to land without a fight. But what does the story of the Channel Islands occupation tell us about what life might have been like if a German invasion of the British mainland had been successful? Well, in the 5 years that the Channel Islands languished under German occupation, life was in some ways dramatically changed. But in others, the way of life on the islands continued as it had done for centuries. What is surprising then is just how quickly the islanders adapted to the new German system and learned to live peacefully with it. Though there was hostility towards the garrison and small acts of resistance, it never amounted to anything that would seriously inconvenience the Germans on the islands. In fairness to the citizens, there was little the people could have done that would have seriously hampered the garrison. The Channel Islands' small size was simply not conducive to an organised resistance, which required a larger population to disappear into. Exact Nazi plans for occupied Britain are rather difficult to pin down. The very nature of the Nazi regime meant that there were competing visions between the fanatic SS, what Hitler wanted, and what could even possibly be achieved within the realm of practicality. Now, the most extreme vision for the British Isles came from the SS, and were insane even by the standards of the Nazi government. They called for the enslavement of the entire British male population between the ages of 16 and 45, while the remainder were to be either exterminated or those deemed Aryan enough were to begin breeding a new generation to submit to German rule forever. Had this been done, rebellion would almost certainly have erupted, and it seems unlikely that Germany, losing millions of men on the Eastern Front, would be able to commit enough men to suppress it. Now, Hitler, on the other hand, had always had a degree of respect for the British. He admired their empire and saw them as like a brother people to the Germans, He hoped to impose peace terms on the British and then build an alliance that would allow the two countries to conquer the Soviet Union and beyond. Now, this is more likely, but still rather optimistic. In truth, the occupation of the Channel Islands probably offers the best glimpse of what an occupation of the United Kingdom itself would have looked like. The grand plans proposed by members of the Nazi High Command would not be practical to carry out while conducting a war in the East and trying to keep control of the West at the same time. One particularly interesting possibility, however, is the installment of Edward VIII on the British throne once more. On the Channel Islands, the Germans showed themselves as willing to respect the British aristocracy if they felt it served their interests. Now, since the late 30s, the exiled King Edward had been in contact with the German government and was discussing the possibility of being returned to his former throne in the event of a German invasion. Now, it's unclear whether or not Edward VIII would have complied with the German demands, but it's also possible they would have restored him as king, whether he wanted to or not. As the king served as a symbol of resistance, forcing George VI to resign and allow his brother to rule once more as a German ally would have been a tremendous victory for the Germans that would help cement their rule in Britain in much the same way that working through the civilian government had helped cement their rule in the Channel Islands. In any case, we can be thankful, of course, that the rest of the world never learned what life under Nazi rule would have been like on a larger scale. The Channel Islands fell, but the British people remained resilient, and even years of nighttime bombing were not enough to break their spirit. As the Americans joined the war and began to strengthen Britain, it was all over. Hitler could never dream of invading mainland Britain, so he had his army reinforce the French coast, because now the tide of victory was in the favour of the Allies. Now, Hitler looked nervously at maps and saw just how close Britain was from the French coast, and at the huge force of landing ships and tanks that were being amassed by the British and the Americans. Invasion was sure to come. But when? And where? Well, these, dear time travellers, are questions to be answered another time. Hello time travellers, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly echoes.